Changing the rear tire or inner tube on the Yamaha Ténéré 700, it's a little bit more tricky than the tire up front because the rear tire is way more beefy. But where there's a will, there's a way, and there's always a trick. Just as up front, the first part to remove is the ABS sensor. But unlike in the front, just leave the brake caliper in place. Once you remove the wheel, the ABS sensor is not protected, and that is the reason why you should remove it. I have reinstalled the rear wheel with or without removing the rear brake pads, but removing the brake pads will making the reinstall of the rear wheel a lot easier. Especially if you just install brand new rear pads, because then you have less space between the pads and the disc. A little bit of wood blocking underneath the rear tire will keep the tire in place when you remove the rear axle. So a 2x4 laid on its flat that's 1.5 inches tall, roughly 40 millimeters, will do the trick if you have a sander stand on your bike. The most useful accessory you can install onto your Ténéré 700. The rear axle is fastened by a 27 millimeter nut, and when you loosen it, it's all about leverage. The fastening specification for the rear axle nut is 77 pound-feet. The rally raid tool and the ratchet in my toolkit have roughly the same amount of usable length, 6 inches. 6 inches is half a foot, so when you take 77 pounds divided by half, you get 154 pounds. So that means that you need to push down with a force of 154 pounds in order to loosen the nut. The breaker bar at the bottom have an effective length of 16 inches. That is 1 1/3 feet. So with 16 inches of leverage, you only need to push down with 58 pounds. In short, leverage is king. Remove the nut, the washer and the adjusting block and just push on the axle. And then you can go to the other side of the bike and just pull it out. Remove the blocking underneath the wheel, and then you push the wheel forward and then you can remove the chain. The safest thing is to remove the 2 little pipe collars from the wheel so you don't lose them, and put all the little pieces back onto the axle in the correct sequence. And then in case you get interrupted, then you know that when you put everything back together, you're not missing any parts, especially the 2 collars. Just as with the front wheel, a 5-gallon bucket can be a good stand to put the wheel on. But the rear wheel, because it's much beefier, requires a little bit higher level of wrestling skills. It will take a full minute to let all the air out of the rear tire, but if you unscrew the valve before all the air pressure has been released, the valve might shoot out and you might not be able to find it again. And that is probably less time than it will take to find you the valve again if it fell on the ground in between pebbles or in the mud. Or if you don't have a spare valve, the time it'll take you to walk home. With a cheap valve tool, you can use it to release the air and to unscrew the valve core. With an expensive one, you're going to have to find a little stick on the ground or use your Allen wrench to let the air out. The rear tire carries more weight than the front tire, so the rear tire is beefier and the rim is wider than up front. And just as up front, you cannot stretch the steel cord that's inside the bead, that's the edge of the tire. So we have to move that edge into the center of the rim, because the center of the rim has a smaller diameter than the edge of the rim. The rear rim is also wider than up front, and this all makes it way tougher to move the bead into the center of the rim than up front. Just as with the rear axle nut, we need leverage in order to push the edge of the bead into the center of the tire. And with some of these wider tires, it's not easy at all. I have tried to use these lightweight bead breakers, but with zero luck whatsoever. C-clamps, a common woodworking tool, they give you plenty of leverage. The whole clue is that they're not too deep and too big, because then they'll just slide off. I've tried multiple different approaches to releasing the bead from the rim on these big rear tires. Everything from the ratchet down load straps to a whole bunch of different C-clamps, more than shown here. And the 6-inch only gives you room for wood blocking on one side, while the 8-inch gives you space for wood blocking on both sides, so 8-inch is the preferred method. So this is the setup I've come up with, and it works pretty well. I have a big piece of wood for the backing on the rear side, and then I have a little piece of wood blocking between the tire and the clamp, and then I have the main piece of wood, that's the one that's pushing down on the bead, and of course the 8-inch clamp. The whole kit is a little bit on the heavy side thanks to the C-clamp, but you should be able to find some 8-inch C-clamps that's a little bit lighter. I made a piece of bead breaker blocking 6 inches wide, almost 1.5 inches tall and 1 inch thick. And it needs to be made out of solid wood. I tried plywood, but that's just gonna crack. This bead blocking is made for an 18-inch rim, so then you take the diameter divided by 2, then you have the radius, and then you add the dimension for the edge of the rim, and then you have the smallest radius on the bead blocking. The largest radius on the bead blocking is the dimension from the edge of the rim to the edge of the thread on the tire. And just deduct 1/8 of an inch or so just to give yourself a little bit of leeway. So with this info you can make yourself a bead blocking for whatever size tire you have on your bike. Having center lines clearly marked on the 2 pieces of wood used for the C-clamp blocking makes it a lot easier to align all the pieces. Applying a thin coat of oil to the threads of the C-clamp and just screwing the screw in and out before you use it will make the process a lot easier. The piece of wood between the C-clamp and the tire keeps the C-clamp from sliding down in the beginning. The hole in the bead breaker blocking also keeps the C-clamp from sliding down, and it fits into the movable jaw of the C-clamp. And the blocking on the rear side spreads the load and also protects the rim and the tire. No, it does not need to be radius, but it just looks cooler. The way I do it, because the tires are so stiff, is that I push both of the side walls of the tire into the center of the rim, and then I fish it out to the outside, because then the beads have a smaller diameter to battle with. The whole point of this kit was to have something that I could bring with me out on the road, and that's why I only use one C-clamp. And just as with the rear axle nut, by applying leverage and a little bit of time, you can move objects that are not easy to move in a safe way. That is no flying tire spoons. Once the inside of the rim is visible, then you can use the bead breakers in order to speed up the process, but it's not necessary. The piece of wood blocking would slide underneath the edge of the rim and stay there, and then you can use the tire spoon to loosen the rest of the tire bead around the rim. And once you're done on one side, you just flip the wheel over and proceed with the other side. I like to remove the sprocket and include all the little rubber dampeners, because then the wheel is more stable. And you remove the sprocket by just putting one hand on each side of the sprocket and just pulling it straight out. There are no fasteners involved. The bead breaker block will automatically pop in behind the lip of the rim, and that's perfect because it keeps one edge of the bead or one edge of the tire in the middle of the rim. So once the little wooden block is behind the little lip of the rim, you can just use a tire spoon to get the rest of the bead into the center of the rim. Once the beads on both sides of the tire are in the center of the rim, then I fish one side to the outside of the rim. By putting the tire spoon between the tire and the wood blocking and just twisting, the wood blocking will pop right out. But don't remove the wood blocking until you got a large part of the bead to the outside of the rim. When replacing the rear inner tube, I usually just fish one sidewall of the tire to the outside of the rim and just fish out the inner tube. If the tire in the rear has been on the rim for a long time, or if they did not use tire mounting compound when they mounted the tire to the rim, it can be very, very tough to get the tire off the rim. If you're planning on taking a long trip and you know that your tire might be very hard to take off the rim, it might be a good idea to just remove it before you go on a trip. Put tire mounting compound on both sides, remount it because it's super easy then. And then if you have a flat on the road, you have way easier conditions to deal with. Just as up front, I removed the standard inner tube and then replace it with a Michelin heavy duty inner tube. I did this because the roads here in the deep south are a little bit on the rough side, and anything that minimizes the chance of a puncture or a flat is welcome. Unlike up front, because the diameter of the inner tube is smaller, in the rear you need to pop in a little bit of air in order to pop the tube into the tire. Also, these heavy duty inner tubes, they are just too big to be used as a spare compared to the standard duty ones. As mentioned countless times before, get one of these inexpensive valve tools, a heck of a lot better than expensive ones. And one of the reasons why I really like them is because I use the threads on the lower left hand side to fish out the valve from the rim. I've mounted front and rear tires with and without tire compound, and especially in the rear, using tire mounting compound, your job is a fraction of what it could be. Absolutely necessary. A thin layer of the tire mounting compound is all that is needed. When mounting the front tire, I didn't see much need in the bead body from Motion Pro, but at the rear, it really helps. Many tires have a directional indicator molded into the sidewall of the tire, so just double check to see if it has before you mount the tire back on the rim. And if it does, just check that you mount it in the correct direction. Some tires have red or green dots on them on the sidewalls. If it has a red dot, align the red dot with the valve on the rim, and if it's a green dot, align it opposite the valve. When mounting the bead back on behind the lip of the rim, using a bead body or some kind of blocking to keep the bead in place makes it a lot easier. I use the bead breaker blocking in order to keep the bead in the center of the rim, and that makes installation a lot easier. And then I alternate by using 2 tire spoons, bringing the bead behind the lip of the rim. And once you start feeling more resistance, just do smaller steps at a time. And then you can remove all the blocking. When both speeds are on the inside of the rim, the inner tube can be inflated. When using tire mounting compound, it doesn't take a lot of pressure at all to seat the beads. If the beads are dry, you will need roughly 3 times the pressure in order to seat them. After the beads pop into place, 1 pop per side, then it's time to check the tire pressure, and it's 36 psi on the road for the Ténéré 700. That's the pressure in the rear. In the front it's 32 psi. Before mounting the rear wheel back onto the bike, the rubber dampeners and the rear sprocket needs to be installed. No tools are needed for this part, just press everything into place. When you mount the wheel in between the swing arm, make sure that the slot in the brake caliper is back in the slot in the swing arm. Also make sure that the ABS sensor has been removed so you do not damage it. Pry the brake pads apart, and if you just installed brand new pads, it might be easy just to remove them. Make sure that the wheel is aligned with the swing arms, because that makes it a lot easier to install it. Mount the 2 pipe collars back onto the wheel, and then you can roll the wheel up onto the little 2x4 or 1.5 inch thick wood blocking, and then you can insert the axle. When you put the adjusting blocks back onto the rear axle, be aware that they are different. The one with the smallest lip, the smallest little angle, goes where the nut is. Push the wheel forward so the 2 aluminum adjusting blocks are touching the little bolt heads. And then you can torque the nut to the specified 77 pound-feet. Reinstall the ABS sensor and reinstall the brake pads if you remove them. And the moment the pads are back in place, just remember to push down on the rear brake pedal in order to seat the pads closer to the disc. Depending on how the tire was mounted on your rim, if they used the tire mounting compound or not, and if it's super hard to get off, you might scratch off the rim. And then one of these little paint pens is the perfect way to get rid of all the little scratches and make the rim pretty again. Having a little bit of tire mounting compound in your toolkit, that's really a no-brainer, because it makes the whole process crazy easy compared to not having anything at all. You should really just use soap and water if the whole world is burning and you cannot get anything else, because soap contains lye, and lye is a corrosive agent. So if you do not have a tube in your tire, then it'll cause corrosion and it will cause small leaks. Not recommended at all. Tire mounting compounds usually comes in gallon size pails or bigger, so just get with your riding buddies, share out into little containers, and you'll still have enough compound left for your grandkids to inherit. And a little cut down sponge into your kit makes that a lot easier to apply. If your tire was recently mounted and they use tire mounting compound, then it's very easy to take on and off. You can just use the tire mounting spoons. But if it's completely dry or they did not use tire mounting compound, then it's thoroughly a beast to take off. And that's why you need a C-clamp. Just as mentioned in the video about the front inner tube tire, there's enough storage space underneath the top rear plastic cover to store an inner tube, 1 per side, except that you have to remove about 25 fasteners to get to the inner tubes. And if you have side racks like me, you can add half a dozen more fasteners. The rear axle nut on the Yamaha Ténéré 700 has a locking washer on the outside of the axle nut, not between the nut and the washer. I assume this is some design they came up with after a little bit too much sake. And what happened on my bike was that washer locked up and damaged the adjusting block on the other side of the axle. First time I saw this, I went through the internet and tried to find the locking washer like this. No luck. I also went through a big stack of motorcycle repair manuals, part manuals that I have laying around. Never ever seen anything like it. So on my bike, I'm going to change it back to the way it's supposed to be, not this fucked up Japanese sake version. Because for me, it happened at my house, which was good. not out in the middle of nowhere, which would not have been good. Thanks for watching. Have a good safe ride. Please subscribe. More videos to follow.